1, 2, 3, audio test.
Hi, this is CB Radio Magazine.com, and today I got a really big treat for you guys. Not only did I recently get my hands on an amazing radio, a CPI 300 here, and I got a couple other cool things to go with it, but I'm here talking with Dave Wisherd, who was one of the original founders, along with Bob Artigo, of CPI, which is Communications Power Incorporated. And I have a ton of questions to ask him, and I'm so excited about this because it's kind of a chance to document some of the history behind the company, some of the information on the radios people may not know about, and kind of talk about how it started and finished and what these radios meant to the people designing them, the company, and what we as hobbyists and CB guys really love about them, how it all kind of came about. So Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thank you, Dave, for inviting me.
Yeah, so right off the bat, first question, let's go back to when this started. And this is around 1975, from what I've read and understand. And what was going on in the CB world at that time period? And who were the big players? And how did you and Bob meet and get this going?
Okay, well, that's quite a few questions. But I'll try to combine them. I guess first, Bob and I, we met at a place called Communication Transistor Corporation. Should find some similarities to CPI there. And we both worked in different parts of the company, engineering, but the company made RF power transistors. I had actually known the company from working at Motorola on a product called the UHF Micor, where I was engineering group leader for design of that radio. And we used a transistor in this company for our transmitter, 100-watt UHF transmitter. And Bob worked in HF, and his biggest customer was Palomar, which, by the way, after Motorola for CTC, Communication Transistor Corporation, was their second largest customer. Palomar Electronics down in San Diego. Motorola two-way mobile radio was the largest, but the next biggest was Palomar. So wow. Bob and I met and started talking about CB. He was ham. We both had been hams. He was still ham. I was no longer active in ham radio operator, but we got talking about CB, which he'd learned a lot about since his customer and customers for the HF power transistors were predominantly making CB linears, and illegal, of course, at the time. Mm-hmm. they called them ham radio. And so I had previously worked as an design engineer for Motorola, as I mentioned, at two-way, and also an aircraft radio company called King Radio in Kansas City. And so I had spent quite a bit of time designing radios with some of the pieces of technology that might be useful in CB. So we just started talking, and in the meantime, Palomar, his largest customer, he ran a few ideas by them, and we cooked up the idea that they would sponsor us and fund us to start a radio company.
And what was Palomar's interest in doing that?
They wanted some radios. Their main business was our CB linears, power amplifiers, which they're making about 1,000 a day of those, by the way.
Wow.
And so Bob had decided that the power transformers, ferrite transformers, are used to match the transistors. So it was a business. People struggled to make them. So there were a number of people making linear power amplifiers down in San Diego, in addition to Palomar, a company called Pride, Downstate. I don't know.
Yeah, Pride.
There was a zillion of them. So Bob decided there might be a business in making and selling the matching transformers for that. And hence the name of the company, Communications Power Incorporated, because they were power transformers. And so,
interesting.
And so Bob had run that by Palomar, and then began some discussions. I'd mentioned to him some things we might think about. He'd asked me actually originally some things that we might want to do in terms of technology to bring into CB. So we bounced it around, and so he bounced by them the idea that, hey, would you like to fund us to make a radio for you? And which would become the Digicom 100.
Right on.
And it combined a lot of high performance receiver technology that I had learned at Motorola, where the land mobile business, higher frequencies, UHF and above, but the land mobile business is loaded with interference problems. And so really high performance receivers are critical in land mobile radio. And then working for King Radio, they were a real leader in digitally synthesized AM radios for aircraft, not single side, but AM, and basically VHF, 118 to 136 megahertz. So had learned quite a bit about the digital part of radio from King, who were considerably more advanced in that area than Motorola was. So I was able to combine those two and working with Bob to do the Digicom 100 radio for Palomar. And they wanted a product that, again, it could be unique and different. And everybody loved the idea of the digital synthesizer because everybody loved extra channels A and B. The FCC was making a lot of talk at that time, 75, about 1975, 74, 75, about expanding CB to as many as 70 channels. There were discussion, would they be sideband only? There were a whole bunch of things. The AM people, particularly E.F. Johnson and really the two major Chinese or Japanese manufacturers were Uniden and particularly Uniden. So they had pushed very hard to keep it AM only, to keep the radios inexpensive and that sort of thing. So,
and as you started in on the Digicom 100 development and everything, and when you started going to the FCC, I was reading one of the other articles, you were saying that Cobra and E.F. Johnson, or somebody was saying, I think this, that they put some pressure on the FCC back towards you guys. Was that true, that they didn't really want some of the stuff you were doing with these radios?
That's true. I mean, when we first did a type acceptance on the Digicom 100, it went pretty smoothly. It was totally new to the FCC at that time, in the CB market anyway, for a synthesized radio. But the FCC, we got through it pretty easily. And then all of a sudden, our competitors complained that they, we had pulled off something that we shouldn't have, which was by having two knobs. In essence, we could address up to 100 channels, 0 to 99.
Yeah.
And so they felt like that it could easily be illegal, et cetera. We really sold it to the market at the time. In fact, I see the CP300 there. The CP300 was sold with the idea that if you buy this radio and the channel expansion comes, we'll retrofit it. And we retrofitted a few thousand radios, actually, that were sent back. And we basically changed the PROM memory, retuned them, and sent them back out. But we upgraded radios. So the idea was people could buy a 23-channel radio, which is the CP300 originally was. And then, since it was a large investment, I think the radio was like $400. I don't remember, something like that in 1976 money. So significant investment. So that radio would be obsolete. It could be sent back and upgraded to whatever the channel expansion became.
Yeah,
and that was a big selling feature for us.
This particular one has had that modification to it, as you can see. We're up on channel 38 here on this one. So this must be one of the units that came back. This unit actually came from an employee who worked for you, who I met, and he lives locally here and actually sold the radio to me. So that's how I came into getting this one in here, which is pretty interesting, which kind of led to the whole interest more. He was telling me a little bit about it, and then that's how I reached out to you. So the Digicom 100, that was the first radio you made under the CPI company, but it wasn't made with the CPI branding. It was made as the Palomar Digicom 100. So
that's correct. Can
you tell me a little bit about the technology and what went into that first radio?
Sure. Well, that was really the platform for all subsequent CPI radios. It used pretty much the same basic radio scheme. The frequency synthesizer was unique at the time. It came from a variety of sources. The phase detector actually was a summer student project a few years earlier by an intern at Collins Radio that got published, so we used that. But the most of the synthesizer was pretty straightforward. Probably what was really unique in the radio was using a single IF system for both AM and single sideband. So to my knowledge, during that period of time and for a few years after, nobody did the same thing. We had a special crystal filter made for the IF, an 8-pole crystal filter that had switchable bandwidth between basically a 2.3 and 5 kilohertz. So that single filter, 8-pole crystal filter, could be used for both AM and single sideband. And so the radio was used a single IF system to both generate and receive AM and single sideband, always transmit and receive through that same crystal filter. So that was pretty unique. That was in the Digicom, and again, that same basic schema, 10.2 megahertz IF, those kinds of things were pretty much the same through all the radios. The basic structure of the radio never changed.
Now the Digicom 100 that got FCC approval
Yes.
to go out as a 23 channel radio.
Yes, yes.
Were those modified later as well for 40 channels?
No, not legally. I'm sure they were. There was a brisk business in EEPROMs. We used a plug-in EEPROM. In those days, a memory chip was pretty expensive, and so you could buy erasable PROMs that would basically erase by UV light from people like National Semiconductor, so who we bought them from. So the memory chip that basically took the information from those two knobs on the front and converted it into the count ratio of the synthesizer was really just a read-only memory. Interestingly enough, by a piece of trivia, and then money, when we bought a ROM, was P-channel, which had some weird negative voltages and stuff, but we paid $2.50 for that read-only memory. And that's in 1975, $76. Today, you can buy flash memory, and that memory was 128 bytes. Today you can buy flash memory for 128 gigabytes for less than that. So,
yeah, that is.
So it's a little different, but at the time it was a big deal, and so that basic structure of the ROM to take the channel information and encode the synthesizer, the IF system, the receiver front end. We used basically learned from Motorola. We used a really high performance JFET front end. Same JFET we used on the receive preamp, by the way, and that gave what's called intercept point. Gave very high ability to, very good ability to handle high strength signals, and not cause what we call desensitization in FM or cross mod in the AM and sideband world. So the high performance receiver front end, the IF structure, the synthesizer, again, all those things were present in the Digicom.
Awesome. And a lot of that, the noise floor on your radios that were produced was lower than some other ones at the time because of this technology, correct?
That's correct. Something we added later to the CPI radios, which was not present in the Digicom, were a couple things. We put in a logarithmic speech compressor to really boost up the audio, particularly for single sideband. And we also added a noise blanker, and it was a really good noise blanker. We spent a lot of time on that. And so the noise blanker made a big difference for, again, noise performance, not just ignition noise, but all kinds of general ignition, or not general sparking and that kind of stuff that causes problems, particularly on single sideband. So with a fast attack slow decay AGC system that's used in single sideband, having a really good noise blanker is critical. And we, by the way, made a retrofit kit for that for the Digicom, which we made for Palomar, so they could retrofit the Digicoms with that noise blanker.
Really? Okay, so that's interesting too. So you guys went from the Digicom, you decided, hey, what we've learned here, we could make our own radios. And is that kind of how that just naturally progressed to the CPI 300?
Yeah, it is. I think that, the Digicom 100 was a rush job. We did that whole, it's like having a baby. We did that whole radio in 9 months. It was just Bob and I. So I basically designed every inch of that radio, the mechanics, everything, designed the circuit boards. For the first time in my life, I had to lay out a circuit board. I'd worked for big companies that always had draftsmen do that kind of thing. They're far more skilled than I am. So if you look at the Digicom, you kind of see that. But I did the breadboard, I designed the radio, flew down to Palomar's mechanical shop one night, working all night on drawings to get the first mechanical chassis made and that sort of thing, and designed the radio, hired the people to build it, bought all the parts, set up the factory, did the whole thing. It was kind of fun, but it was a pretty busy 9 months. But and the radio did reflect that it was kind of done in a hurry, and we had to. It was time was money. We had to get it out and get some income. So, but the radio did well. Palomar sold quite a few of them, and that's what funded this. And we were able to hire Steve Meath as an engineer and some draftsmen and technicians, and hire some people to come in and help us. But And all those people contributed significantly to the CP300, 400, 2000, and 2500. But the same basic radio, but we continually made improvements in as we went forward.
That's kind of a whirlwind of growth happening there with all those people coming in all of a sudden. So you guys grew pretty rapidly at that point. And then this was your next radio, was the CP300. Why not the CP200? I guess is the question, from the Digicom 100 to the CP300.
I don't remember why we came up with CP300, to be honest with you. I don't remember. I don't know.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oh, so, I know. I think the idea was that if you had 100 channels, upper, lower, sideband, and AM gave you 300 channels. I think that was the idea.
Gotcha. Okay.
Even that's not really true.
So this radio in front of us is that next generation, which had some of the features you already discussed, with the speech processing in it, which was something that was in this radio that wasn't in the Digicom 100, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and you guys ran into a little bit of an issue with that, which is kind of interesting. The FCC didn't really like your speech compression, and that's one of the reasons we don't see a microphone gain on the radio. Is that correct, or how did that all work?
Not quite like that. Actually, we sold the speech compression because the way the system worked, particularly on AM, is everything went through a crystal filter. So with the control loops, ALC, and even with the speech compressor, it was impossible to overmodulate. Now that hurt us a little bit in the AM market. Some people like the booming overmodulated voice that splattered into all the channels, but and that was a real thing in AM. But actually that part of the radio wasn't a problem. A lot of the people making the CyberNet and Uniden radios, and CyberNet and Uniden made Cobra, virtually everybody with a couple of exceptions bought their radios from one of those two people. And Uniden at the peak of the boom was making 50,000 radios a day. CPI in its entire history never made 50,000 radios. So it was big business. And what they did with the Japanese radios is the microphone gain allowed you to overmodulate. There was no ALC, no automatic level control, no control system. So basically what the ALC did is it just determined how high you modulated the AM. So the meta splattered and that kind of thing. So the FCC decided to outlaw them. The time we type accepted our radios, for this particular radio, the CP300 and 400, they had a prohibition against microphone gain controls. We convinced them that the way our system worked, it wasn't an issue. So we were able to add that to the CP2000 and the CP2500.
Oh, okay. So that's you were able to get it in later. Gotcha.
The way we got around it on these radios is we bought a power mic from Turner in Cedar Rapids, and that had a mic gain control. If you look, see at the top, that slider. So that's the equivalent of mic gain control, because the people really wanted a mic gain control. Reality was with our radios, it was kind of silly because there was an ALC and it automatically adjusted the levels anyway. But it didn't matter. People liked that having that mic gain control. So so that's how we solved the problem with the 300 and 400.
And you guys had some accessories that all of a sudden started showing up. So we have the base power supply here that has the built-in speaker. I've got a FC60 frequency counter here, and there was a bunch of other stuff, which I'll throw some of the pictures up on the screen here as we're talking. How did all the accessories come into play? Did you guys produce those yourself? Did you have third parties produce them for you, or just they produced the parts and you guys did the cases? Because one of the really cool things about all the products was your products all matched, and the look and feel of them, I have to say, it's almost kind of a Herman Miller kind of architectural look to the radios, where they all had the matching, look and feel, the knobs, but the accessories themselves matched up really well as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the accessories?
Now the accessories, so we did all of them ourselves. We didn't buy anything and resell it. Drop ship, they call that. We had everything was designed in-house. Most of the digital accessories, like the one you see there, the FT50, there was FT76, FC70 that had 7 digits. So there's a variety of frequency counters. This particular one here in the picture, we bought a chip, I think it was Siliconics, had come out with a counter chip, so we used that because less expensive. But all the digital stuff, Bob Samsel was project engineer, Steve Meath was project in the radio, And I was project engineer on all of the other accessories, the RF, analog, this receive preamp, speech compressor, TVI filters, things like that. But we all worked together and helped each other. So it was a really group effort.
And then your production line was here in the United States for all of this assembly of all these chips and boards and all these parts that you guys were sourcing. It all was done here.
Yeah, we initially, we stuffed the boards in-house and then sent the boards out down the street. We're in Silicon Valley, where you get services like that to get them wave soldered, soldering machine. But ultimately, we splurged on a $50,000 D7 soldering machine. And so we did all the soldering, lead trimming and stuff in-house. So no, everything was done in-house. We bought, in fact, most of the parts were American. The circuit boards were purchased locally. The semiconductors, we bought a lot of stuff from Motorola. People like that. So CTC, our old employer, we bought the power transistors from. So the knobs were made in the US. And switches were all American. Switchcraft, Standard Grigsby, CTS, power transformer, and the CP300 came from a Ravenswood in Chicago, made all of our power transformers. So about the only thing in these radios that wasn't American was the electrolytic capacitors, which by that time, you couldn't purchase any quality capacitors that weren't super industrial or military grade expensive. So we bought all our electrolytic capacitors from Digicom, except the tantalums, which were Chemet and Union Carbide. They were American. And the resistors came from Americo Sphere, which was also Japanese. So we had Japanese small resistors, quarter watt resistors, and Japanese electrolytic capacitors. But pretty much everything else was US. That was kind of the end of a lot of those companies, by the way, being around to make components. All our meters came from Logitech in New Hampshire. So, so pretty much everything was, knobs were made initially by Rogan in Chicago, and later on Electronic Hardware out of Brooklyn. But pretty much everything was the knob. The panels were, the front panels were probably one of the more interesting components. Bob Artigo came up with that. Long story, we had a neighbor work for Safeway, and there was company called Sellotape in the Bay Area that was making labels for hams and stuff like that at meat at the Safeway stores, grocery stores. And they had come up with this dual layer, really sophisticated labeling process. And so Bob brought some in and we stuck them in a refrigerator and froze them and did all kinds of stuff and say, this is pretty cool, you know, you can backlight them and there's no printing on the front. So the printing, you know, the letters don't wear off as you use it, which always bothered me with metal plates. Now, the Digicom was not done that way. It was done by the old-fashioned faceplate process, company that Palomar used. But all the CPI stuff used this sellotape label, which was kind of neat because it didn't wear and you could backlight it and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was pretty much everything was American made.
Yeah, and I mean, these have stood up really well in terms of how many collectors still have these in really nice condition, where we see a lot of other older radios tend to start fading in certain areas or discoloring. But you know, the quality, I mean, the cases on these are bomber too. I mean, these things are really heavy duty compared to some of the other, even radios nowadays aren't made to that standard.
Yeah, we bought the Segundo manufacturing over in Union City, did all the stamping for us. And then the painting was actually Sherwin-Williams Pole T, really high quality paint. By the way, I think it still exists as industrial now. It was basically put on electrostatically. So they had really nice paint on these radios. And
yeah, they've held up really well. So CP300, you guys marketed this. As we kind of were talking about earlier, you were kind of going after that higher end CB user who was looking for extra quality, extra features. And you guys sold it that way to those, a little bit more of that hobbyist crowd who are a little bit more serious. And then how did the sales go back then? Were there trade shows and how did you guys get into the CB dealers? And was it a lot of mail order for your particular product, or where did you get the most sales?
Everything was what they used to call two-step. So we sold to distributors, CB of America, Amateur Electronic Supply of Milwaukee. I remember some of them. There were distributors around the country. Benny's Wholesale Warehouse out in Berwick, Pennsylvania was a biggie for us. So there were different distributors that we would sell the radios to, and then they would turn around and sell them to dealers. The radios typically went out our door about half of list price. So if the radio was $600 list, we would get about 300 for it, and then about 15 or 20% markup from the distributor. Then the rest of it went to dealers. So it was all done by two-step. Advertising in the CB magazines of the day was important. But fortunately, in CB, everybody talks to each other, and so frankly, word of mouth, particularly among the hobbyist crowd, was really powerful for us.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody, from kind of discussing some of the stuff that was happening, everybody kind of knew each other at that time in the industry as well. You guys all knew who each other were, who were doing these big things at the time in CB, correct?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, when I was a kid, in high school, I worked at a two-way radio shop, and they didn't want to touch. It was business radios, FM, land mobile. They didn't want to mess with CBers for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is worried about getting paid. So I set up a little Heathkit instruments shop at home and fixed CBs. And one of the radios I fixed a couple of was called Tram, and this is during the initial CB boom back in the early '60s. Of course, everything was vacuum tubes. So the time we came onto the scene 10 or 12 years later, after that first boom and the second boom in the mid '70s, Tram still existed. Browning Laboratories, both of those are in Laconia, New Hampshire, were both big players in the high-end radio business, all vacuum tube. And then, of course, Cybernet and Uniden made a whole variety of radios for pretty much all the brands. Sideband engineers, SBE in Watsonville, they bought radios from a company called Kokusai and actually did some design work with Kokusai. So their radios were a little different, SBE, and pretty high end, I'd say close to being competitors of ours in terms of the Japanese radios. Most of the rest of the radios were all made by one of those two Japanese suppliers, and some later Korean suppliers who copied them really, but not the high end.
How did everybody else view you at that time coming out with these radios? How did they look at your company, and did they see you as a threat or not because you weren't producing that many, or what did they think of what you guys were doing?
Well, I think if you were called Corn at Cobra or one of those, you didn't even know we existed. But if selling really high volume, Johnson, E.F. Johnson, was making 5,000 or 10,000 a day of the 123s, two factories making radios, so they didn't pay much attention to us. And I knew some guys at Johnson from my mobile radio days, but Tram and Browning, we got to know them quite well. We actually helped Tram a few times. The O'Callahan family, John and Jack, father and son, ran that. I've met Gar Green at Browning Labs in Laconia, but we didn't really have much to do with them. But everybody got along. Browning Labs is an old-time company. They go back to the '30s, the early days of radio. Why those two companies ended up in Laconia, Browning and Tram, I really don't know. I never heard that story, but they're about 2 or 3 hours north of Boston, way up in the center of New Hampshire. But yeah, we did some work with Tram and got to know them. In fact, one of my old boss at Motorola ended up going there. I recommended him to be vice president of engineering at Tram. So we knew them pretty well. Nice people, and really wasn't much competition. Tram and Browning pretty much more catered to the AM hobbyist, and then later on there was a company called Stoner, Don Stoner, who was actually
Stoner is pretty interesting radio as well.
They came on after we did. Both Browning and Tram preceded us by forever. There were two companies that came on after we did in the high-end CB market. One was called ARF down in New Mexico. Very sophisticated radio, and they don't think they made a lot of radios. And then Stoner, Don Stoner, he had a company called Stoner Gorell that made commercial. Gorell made commercial sideband radios up in the Seattle area, and so he spun. I don't know if they were tied in, but they spun off Stoner radios for the CB market, and so those were both competitors of ours too.
Interesting.
I knew Don Stoner very well. I really didn't know the guys there. I met them at trade shows, and we the Consumer Electronics Show. There were several trade shows a year that we all went to.
So CP300 then CP400. What differences and things did you try and do with the next radio?
The 400 was pretty much the same radio. We just basically took it, type accepted it, took it to 40 channels. That's why you could retrofit a 300 to be a 400. They were basically exactly the same radio.
Gotcha. And then the next step was the one that is probably the most collectible, I guess, at this point, that everyone just loves, is the CPI 2000, and that came after the CPI 400, correct?
Yes, and that we did one a year. We did the Digicom in 75. We did the CP 300, 400 in 76, and then we did the in 77 we did the CP 2000, and then the CP 2500 was a year after that. So we kind of had a year cycle on the radios. We continued to make the previous models, of course, not the 300, but we continued to make the CP 400 really through the entire life of the company. But the CP 2000 was, as I said, was kind of my favorite radio. And we recognize looking at this picture, most people bought these radios, didn't put them under the dash in the car. They put them on an adapter or put a power supply and use it as a base. So it became pretty obvious that the real market was base stations. So that's why we did the CP 2000. And at that time, we could add a mic gain control and a bunch of other nice little features, VSWR measurement, things like that, low VSWR.
What were the biggest changes between the CP300, 400, and the 2000?
Fundamental changes. We changed the power amplifier in the back, went to a design with a bigger harmonic, more effective harmonic filter because it's the new FCC regulations, more poles in the filter. We added a directional coupler so we could measure VSWR. And we beefed up the RF power amplifier, cooled it better, but we went to an aluminum housing from steel, which is what we had on the CP 300 and 400. As far as the main receiver board and synthesizer board, noise maker, all that kind of stuff, it's identical. So really what we changed was the RF power amplifier, and again, I added a mic gain control and a few things like that. But
and then you also went away from the dual knobs.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, we had to. The FCC was, they basically said you cannot type accept again a dual knob radio. So for some of the reasons you mentioned before, competitive complaints. So we had to go to a single knob. So we went to a standard Grigsby PC board switch, which at the time was very revolutionary, by the way, that switch, made in Chicago, outside Chicago. So we went to a single switch. But then all you had to do was, add one more bit, and all of a sudden it went from 1 to 40 to 41 to 80. So it kind of did the same thing, but and there was even a hole in the front panel to add the switch and all that kind of stuff, all accidental. And test points, you could just ground the test point and add channels and stuff. But
did you guys kind of understand that was part of making the radio at that time, that you knew those guys were going to do this, so you built those features kind of in knowing that they were going to add extra channels?
Yep, that's true. That's true. I mean, it's to sell to the customers we had, who were the high-end hobbyist type customers. They wanted the extra channels, and so we and everybody kind of did that way, or one way or another, frankly. But maybe we just made it a little easier. I guess. But most any radio could be tricked up to go to 80 channels or something like that. Usually went above the channel 40.
Which one was the best selling radio out of all the radios you guys produced?
Probably, that's a good question. I think probably the CP 2000, although it was born later. Although we had a longer run with the CP 300, 400, so I'm not really sure. There was a peak in CB that occurred 75, 76, the song on the radio, and a lot of people were drawn into CB thinking that it was going to be a mobile phone. They could call the wife on the way home from work, do I need to pick up some bread and milk at the 7-Eleven or something? And so between the faddish, not everybody wanted to, and no disrespect, but not everybody wanted to talk like an Oklahoma truck driver and like on the song, and they didn't, then the radio didn't really provide a mobile radio kind of a function, where I think a lot of people that I talked to had bought a CB. They expected it to be kind of like what later on a cell phone became. I had worked on cell phones at Motorola before all of this, so I knew this was not a cell phone. But so consequently, the boom kind of peaked maybe in 76 and started to drop off. But what the boom brought was a whole bunch of people, some of which would like the idea of playing with radio. And so, okay, most of them, stuck it up on the shelf with their original Atari Pong game, as well as boring now. But some people actually kind of liked it. And so those were our customers. They'd probably been exposed to buying a Cobra or some kind of Johnson radio or something. Nothing wrong with those, but they're simple basic AM radios. And so some smaller percentage of those people. So our peak occurred a year or two later than what Cobra and Johnson and those guys saw, because we saw people that, okay, they got tired of the Johnson 123, or they heard about single sideband, or they wanted a higher performance radio, or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So our peak occurred a couple year or two beyond where the main CB peak occurred.
And then the last radio you guys produced was the CPI 2500. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that one is quite a bit different from everything in front of it, in terms of it was a mobile radio that had a detachable head, basically, which we see a lot of nowadays in ham radio and stuff. But at the time, that was pretty unique.
Yeah, it was. Of course, coming from Motorola and the Micor and mobile, police and fire and industrial radios, they were all made that way. Well, that's not true. They had a line of radios that were dashed up, but most of the better radios were trunk mount, and then they had a control head. So kind of learned that from Motorola. Again, we thought that there would be people would want to take this thing mobile, because even the CP300 400 was really too big to be stick under the dash. And so the idea was to have a much smaller control head, but still have a more capable radio. The CP2500 again was pretty much the same radio as the CP2000, except that it had the serial control and that kind of thing. So you could have a control head and transmitter, receiver, serial stuff. So the idea was, in fact, I think we advertised it like that, is you could take the CP2000 and put it in your car. And regular CP2000 is a little bit big for that, so unless you had a pretty good sized truck.
So tell us a little bit about, you guys were doing these radios, they're popular, you're trying to knock out as many as you can a year. And then at what point did things kind of change, I guess? And I know there's some, there was some sad points after that, that you discussed in one of your notes there about having to let people go and stuff. So can you tell us a little bit about, what happened after that initial heyday where you guys were really producing as many as you could?
Yeah, it was a bubble, and as I mentioned, we caught the latter part of the bubble. So maybe 77, something like that, was maybe the peak after the 74, 75 original big peak. Again, probably more than anything else, but the movie, Burt Reynolds movie, and the song on the radio and that kind of thing. So it was dropping off. And so the whole market was dropping off. And plus we had real issues. One of the problems we had is our radio sold toward the end better than some of the Cobra on a relative scale, percentage-wise, better than some of the earlier AM models, which really dropped off the table. So we had problems with our distributors, I won't mention any names, taking money they had gotten from selling our radios and paying off Cobra or somebody to get out of collection. So all of a sudden, we had big problems getting our distributors to pay us. And I can remember I used to go out to trade shows and help the dealers and distributors, but toward the later days, some of my meetings were not so pleasant, trying to get them to pay us and making deals. Hey, we'll send you some more radios, but you got to pay for the other ones. But you end up still at some point in time, you get stiffed, and that really hurt us because we never had a lot of money, and so we just pretty much depended on what's called cash flow. We sell a radio and then be able to pay and buy parts to build more. And so the market dropped off, and probably even more importantly, we just couldn't get people to pay us. And you can put people in the collection and sue them and all that kind of stuff, but that doesn't pay bills. And so it was a tough time. It was a tough time for the distributors. It was a tough time for the dealers, and it was a tough time for us. It all kind of trickles up or down depending on how you look at it. But it was
Did you and Bob have to have that conversation at some point and say, this, we're not going to be able to keep this going?
Oh yeah, we it was pretty obvious. In fact, it got so bad, don't get involved, but this is kind of ironic, but for the last several months, I was the chief financial officer. So in addition to running engineering and manufacturing, I was going up to the banks in San Francisco and begging them not to call our loans. So and finally, we had done some other business, drummed up some business, and if you bought a 2600 Atari game back in '77, when there was a big boom in the first programmable home video game, good chances are that the controller stick you used was made by CPI.
Wow, that is really cool.
And we also designed, Atari was local there, and we designed and built some power supplies for their pinball machines. So we started doing some different businesses. Bob got something new. Billie Jean King's husband, they were a tennis player, and they had come up with a smokeless ashtray. This is back in the anti-smoking days. So we built several thousand smokeless ashtrays. We didn't design it, just built it for Billie Jean King. So we did a variety of things. And so Bob became convinced that the thing to do was just be a contract manufacturer. And that wasn't a bad instinct. Several companies, and pretty much no one anymore makes their own. Look at Apple. I mean, everybody has outside contract manufacturers. They existed even in CPI's day. We just couldn't afford them in those days. They were all US, and time we paid their overheads and everything, it didn't make any sense. But later on, that pretty much no one makes electronics anymore. That's actually a brand. Most all of them have some contract manufacturer make it for them. So Bob's idea was to do that, and I wasn't that interested in it. So and plus, we really couldn't pay all of this anymore anyway. So Steve Meath and I and Bob Samsel, Steve and I went to Varian, and Bob Samsel, I think, ended up at Trimble Navigation doing GPS. Although all of them worked for, I shouldn't say that. The next step, I started another company down the road, and many of those guys and many of the people, key people, including some of the assembly leads, came to work for us again, but making a cellular base station, something completely different. But it was tough. It's like, it was my first company that I'd ever started, and it was really sad. It's really sad, kind of watching nothing like watching your baby die. It's gross, but I mean,
Yeah.
it was sad to look at something that you'd created. And morning, I laid off 50 people one day. I called them all up because I could just barely afford to give them severance, and and they were very devoted people. They were mostly assemblers, and it's not fun. Anybody tells you that doesn't bother them, something's wrong with them. But,
yeah.
but
But you went on to do a lot of other stuff. What other kind of things did you get involved with your engineering and skills? Where did you go from there, and what else? What other things did you produce?
After CPI, we all went back, not all of us, but went back to Varian and CTC. Steve Meath actually went to work for iMac. Bob Artigo went to CTC. So we all went back there for a while, and then I left with another fellow who was not part of CPI to start a company making a variety of high power transmitters, initially for radar. We also had a wafer fab. We made our own semiconductor chips for power semiconductors. And so we gravitated towards cellular. One of the things I learned at CPI was there was going to be a tremendous demand for cellular. I'd worked with Marty Cooper at Motorola on the first Dynatac phone before I left Mode, and the old brick phone, which, by the way, and then money were $40,000 a piece to make the prototypes. It would talk for 15 minutes and receive for an hour and a half or something. And but I knew from CB and from what I'd been involved with at Mode that cellular was going to happen. What had happened to the extent it did, I had never dreamed, but I knew that there was a huge pent-up demand for cellular because of my previous experiences, particularly at CPI, really. CPI convinced me that what a lot of folks are trying to buy was a cell phone. So when cellular came on, then later in the 80s, we jumped on it early and had great success, went public and all that kind of stuff. Then later on, I started a company right after that, called WareNet. If you watch a football game, you see the circles that track the players. That's a location system that company we had. That we sold it to Zebra Enterprises, and still in business, tracking containers of parts on coming off of ships and cars going through factories and football players. So it was kind of fun. And the last one I did after we sold that company to Zebra, nice people, Zebra, by the way. Then a group of us from that company went off and developed a new kind of clothes dryer using RF power. The first time I went back to HF since CPI days, 13.56, and built a 4.5 kilowatt digital power source that dried clothes, and sold that technology a couple, 3 years ago to LG, and I retired. So here I am.
Wow, that is really cool. So many different things there, and yeah, I mean, I think it's so neat that this is one part all those different companies that you've been involved with, and it's really cool that, you know, I'm sure for you, it must feel very prestigious to be able to have people, you know, go, wow, I love this radio still. And I mean, we're, you know, 40 plus years out from when you originally designed these, and people are still enjoying them every day. And there's a whole group dedicated to these radios. And I mean, I don't know if you've watched eBay lately, but there's been a huge, with the COVID and everybody being at home, radios are selling like crazy on eBay, and collectors have time, I guess. And man, this stuff is now, it could go to auction. They're getting really expensive to find.
Yeah, I'm proud of it. You know, this is the only, other than the clothes dryer, the last company, which is completely different animal. Nobody makes a hobby out of a clothes dryer, but this is the only really consumer electronics I was ever involved. Even in cellular, we weren't involved with handsets. It was strictly the base stations, industrial side of it. But yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun, you know, going out and actually meeting with CBers and going and talking to them, going to clubs. And I learned in business, actually well before this, get to know your customer. You give me an example. The Digicom, we had a really tight squelch. In fact, Tram loved it. They complimented us on it. But in reality, it was a terrible thing for CB. I came out of mobile radio, and so a squelch in a mobile radio, you don't sit and listen to traffic or police or fire distributions, a radio communication system. You just wait for them to call you. And in fact, they have a special squelch that only opens when they're calling you specifically. But so we designed a really good squelch, and I did, hey, these guys are using squelch, and they use a squelch. And so if you undid the squelch, the radio was noisy. And the reason was it was noisy is it had about 20 to 30 dB more IF gain than it should have. So it was actually into squelch limit, into AGC on noise, like an FM radio is. They don't have an AGC on radio, it's just limited FM. But so we designed it to be like an FM radio, and that was a real bad idea. and after going to a few CB meetings, I came back and said, that's a real bad idea. So if you take a look at all the boards after that, I don't remember if it went to the 300 or not, but we actually pulled out a stage of IF gain, just jumpered it out and left it out forever. Probably left the spots on the board in case we ever want to go back. God knows why we want to do that. But so it was a good lesson, and, you know, understand your customer. And the other part is we wanted to make a really good product. I mean, I as a kid, I worked in a two-way shop for a brand of mobile radios, GE. I can say it now, they no longer make two-way radios. They were bad radios. They were bad designs, particularly when they went to solid state, bad support of service and that kind of thing. And so I really wanted to make a good radio, and I think everybody else working there did too. We really wanted to make a good radio. So seeing people like this stuff, yeah, hopefully they enjoy the performance, but hopefully just the quality and make it look different. A guy named Larry Mitchell designed all this stuff for us. I told him make it look like IBM, and he kind of did. And actually, the CP300 on this base station won a design award down in LA, Industrial Design Award. Larry did, and won an award for it. So he did a great job, and so very proud of the styling and that kind of thing. That we wanted to make it look different. We wanted it to be a good quality product, and so yeah, it's kind of fun to see people enjoy it. It makes you feel good. I don't see too many people, you know, enjoying operating their cellular base station transmitters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff there's a lot of products from that time period that people may collect, but they don't actually use them, you know, on a regular basis. And I mean, the people use these and they love them, and they're on the airwaves, and that's really the cool part, is it's something that just continued. It's never stopped.
Yeah, I've not been able to look up anybody since this kind of came up. I kind of lost track with all the guys. Steve Meath in particular, who was the chief radio engineer, is really a superb engineer. And truthfully, actually did even better work for me in subsequent companies than here. But he did a great job here. And he also did moon bounce. He had a 10-meter dish in his backyard. He rebuilt Alfa Romeos. Last time I saw him, he was at a car show, actually. So he did all kinds of stuff, but I've lost touch with him. And I kind of wish I could get a hold of them. I think they'd be proud of what they did, and that folks still enjoy it. That's kind of neat. You know, makes you feel good.
It's fantastic. Well, I guess we'll wrap up here. We covered a lot, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to, not me necessarily, but you're talking to all these guys out there. who love CB radio, are the people that are still really interested in it. The guys, especially the guys that love these radios. Now you're going to have 1,000 questions on this video that are going to come up, I'm sure, because people are going to have lots of questions. So I'll of course send you the link afterwards. And if you want to, maybe you could pop on there and answer a question or two from the people out there, because I'm sure I didn't cover half of what they have for questions for you on all these radios.
I'm happy to try. And again, I sure to everyone who enjoys this radio, this stuff, these radios and accessories, we're really tickled. That's nice.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.